A little girl screamed, "Daddy, that's my brother." The millionaire froze and collapsed in tears. It was a warm afternoon at the bustling city park where families gathered to enjoy the sunshine. Laughter echoed through the trees as children played, couples strolled, and the scent of popcorn and cotton candy floated in the air. Among them was a sharply dressed man in his early 50s, wearing a crisp suit, Italian shoes, and an expression of detachment. This man was Richard Callahan, a real estate tycoon whose name was etched into city skylines and luxury towers. Yet, for all his wealth and power, there was an emptiness in his eyes, the kind that even millions couldn't fill. He walked with his daughter, Lily, a curious and bright-eyed 7-year-old. Lily was the kind of child who noticed everything, the color of the birds, the shapes in the clouds, the smile of a stranger. She clung to her father's hand as they wandered through the park, pulling him toward the carousel. Richard, although distracted by buzzing work emails and silent calls he ignored, smiled gently and allowed her to lead. It was one of the few weekends he could give her his time. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, and he had buried himself in work ever since. He tried his best with Lily, but some part of him was always distant. Near the carousel stood a group of children from a nearby orphanage. They had come on a field trip arranged by a charity organization. The children, dressed in matching blue shirts with smiley faces printed on the back, laughed and played freely. Among them was a boy around the same age as Lily, with tousled brown hair, piercing hazel eyes, and a solemn calmness that set him apart. He didn't speak much but observed everything around him with deep curiosity. As Lily's gaze drifted toward the boy, she stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened, she blinked rapidly as if trying to confirm what she was seeing. Then, without warning, she let go of her father's hand and ran forward, shouting loud enough for everyone to turn. "Daddy, that's my brother." Everything around seemed to stop. The carousel music faded, conversations halted, Richard's heart skipped a beat as the words echoed in his ears. He froze, his face drained of color, and his phone slipped from his hand. He looked up and saw the boy, now staring back at them with a puzzled look. And then he saw it, those eyes. The same hazel shade, the same intensity, the same familiarity. The moment hit him like a tidal wave. It had been over 7 years. Before Lily was born, before his wife, Maria, got pregnant. Back then, Richard and Maria were struggling to conceive. They had tried everything, medications, treatments, specialists. It was a painful journey filled with hope and heartbreak. And in a rare moment of compassion and desperation, Maria suggested they adopt. Richard agreed, albeit half-heartedly, as he was hesitant to raise a child that wasn't biologically his. But Maria fell in love with a baby boy at the local orphanage. His name was Benjamin. They brought him home, and for a few short months, their world was bright. Maria adored Benjamin, and slowly, even Richard began to soften. But then came the miracle. They discovered Maria was pregnant. Richard, overjoyed, started imagining his real family. He wanted to focus on the child that was his by blood. The old selfishness crept back in. And so, when Maria was 3 months pregnant, Richard made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He returned Benjamin to the orphanage. He told himself it was for the best, that they couldn't handle 2 babies. Maria cried for days. She never forgave him completely. But life moved on, and when Lily was born, her innocence and joy became their solace. Richard buried the past, never speaking of Benjamin again. He assumed the boy would be adopted quickly and given a good life elsewhere. But now, standing in this park, his daughter crying with joy and the boy staring with confusion, the past clawed its way back to the surface. Lily ran up to the boy and hugged him tightly. "I saw you in my dreams. I knew you were real," she said. The boy looked around nervously but didn't pull away. Something in him seemed to recognize her too, as if a missing puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Richard took slow steps toward them. Each one was heavier than the last. He felt his knees weaken. His throat tightened. When he reached them, he knelt, his eyes level with the boy's. "What's your name?" he asked, voice shaking. "Ben," the boy replied quietly. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes. His lip trembled. He tried to speak, but the weight of guilt and sorrow crashed down all at once. He collapsed to his knees and sobbed, not the quiet, dignified tears of a proud man, but the heaving, gasping grief of a father who had abandoned his son. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." By now, a few onlookers had begun to gather, unsure of what they were witnessing. One of the orphanage volunteers approached, concerned. Richard looked up at her, his face soaked with tears. "Where has he been all these years?" he asked. The woman, stunned by his breakdown, gently replied, "Ben was never adopted. He's been with us his whole life." The words crushed him. For 7 years, while Richard built skyscrapers and chased billion-dollar deals, his son was sleeping in shared dorms, wearing second-hand clothes, and waiting for someone to call him family. He looked at the woman, then at the boy. "Please," he said, "let me fix this." The weeks that followed were filled with legal meetings, emotional healing, and difficult conversations. Lily and Ben bonded almost instantly. She never let him out of her sight, and he slowly opened up to her warmth. At first, Ben didn't speak much to Richard. There was confusion, hurt, and hesitation. But over time, Richard began to prove himself, not with money, but with presence. He showed up every day. He listened. He shared. He apologized over and over. Eventually, Ben asked him one quiet evening, "Why did you leave me?" Richard's heart clenched. "Because I was selfish," he said honestly. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making it right, if you let me." Ben looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the innocence of a child and the courage of someone who has lived through abandonment, he simply said, "Okay." That night, the three of them sat under the stars in their backyard. Lily giggled, holding both their hands. Richard looked at them, the children he was once blind to. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Not because of the mansion behind him or the millions in his account, but because of the two small hands in his. From then on, Richard became a changed man. He stepped back from his business empire, dedicating more time to his children. He donated generously to the orphanage that had cared for Ben and began working to reform the adoption system in the city. He shared his story publicly, not to redeem himself, but to remind others that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of family. And every time he looked at Ben, he saw not a mistake, but a miracle he had been too blind to cherish the first time. And every time Ben looked back, he saw not a stranger, but a father, flawed, but trying. In the end, love didn't erase the past. But it built a bridge over it. And on that bridge, a little girl once stood and shouted to the world what her heart already knew. "Daddy, that's my brother."